Middle Ages, what do we know about it? First of all, as an era of incredible stagnation, when travel was practically impossible. And right there, the contradiction. The great Marco Polo traveled across all of Eurasia, and thousands of simple peasant pilgrims constantly made dangerous journeys to Jerusalem. We are told that these were the Dark Ages, a time of closed borders, total hostility toward foreigners, and cultural stupor. But look, it was exactly then that we adopted Arabic numerals and paper, and gunpowder arrived from China. And most importantly, this was an era of non-national states, but it is precisely this time that people love to use today as an argument in debates about national identity. The stereotypes surrounding the Middle Ages are countless, and we are here to start sorting out this historical mess. Today's topic is simply colossal. We will show how dramatically different the world we live in is from the world that existed 500, 700, or 1,000 years ago. Why are nations, in essence, merely a political fiction, and a rather late one at that? Where did all those counts, sires, and marquises come from, and where did they disappear to? Why was the system we call serfdom considered progressive and even liberal in those times? And how is the Pope involved in all this? We are talking about feudalism, how this system worked, why it emerged, and why knowing about it is still critically important. We tried to compress and fit all this for you into 20 dynamic minutes. In general terms, everyone imagines this picture, the vertical of power. At the top is the monarch, below him are the counts and seigneurs, and beneath them, in the fields, the peasant farmers toil. The best of them had personal freedom. If things went wrong, they could leave the land, albeit with no property. It wasn't great, of course, but it was still a choice. In the worst case, the peasant was a serf, meaning, with certain caveats, he was tied to the land like a slave. And here's the main question. How is this fundamentally different from the preceding slave-owning system of the Roman Empire? On one hand, hardly at all, but on the other, it was an absolutely new, flexible system that became a liberal replacement for the institution of slavery, which had become hopelessly obsolete. Although the period after Rome is called the Dark Ages, implying general regression, progress certainly took place. To see this, we need to dig deeper into history and understand how feudalism even came into being. Feudalism became a direct reaction to the profound crisis that accompanied the long and painful process of the Western Roman Empire's collapse. Without delving into the military and political causes, let's look at the economics. As you recall from school, Rome was built on the slave-owning system. This means slaves were the key engine of the economy. And here's an important nuance. The slave of that era was not a separate caste, but an object of property. One could become a slave, and a slave could become free. Social mobility, though harsh, was present. Rome was the champion in taking slaves. By various estimates, at its peak, slaves constituted over a third of the total population. But here is an unexpected fact. The empire stopped growing. Conquests ceased, which meant the influx of new labor dried up. Of course, slaves were sometimes permitted to have children, and orphans were enslaved, but overall, their numbers began to inexorably fall. And this meant one thing, a deficit of working hands. Add to this the total political instability of late Rome. Emperors were puppets in the hands of the military. There was constant corruption and lawlessness. Cities, including overcrowded Rome itself, became the least safe places to be. A process began, the opposite of what we see today. a mass exodus of city dwellers back to the villages. There were no slaves, and people had to feed themselves. Free people returned to the land to grow food not only for the market, but also for themselves. Roman authorities tried to forcibly bind people to the cities, where labor was also needed. But eventually, through long compromises, the system of latifundia and colony was formed. Latifundia, or huge private estates, had always existed, but now, free colony began to replace the slaves who had previously worked on an industrial scale. Since many of these free workers had no land of their own, nor money to buy or even rent it, they entered into a sort of barter agreement with the landowners. You give us land to work and protection from bandits, and we give you a portion of the harvest and some minor obligations. Now picture this. The 1st to 5th centuries A.D. The emperor is a shadow of the past. Barbarians are constantly raiding. To defend themselves, landowners began fortifying their villas, transforming them into genuine castles. By 440 A.D., the Roman authorities, realizing the regular army couldn't cope, permitted the latifundia to create their own militias. The idea was to organize faster border defense, but it's clear what this led to. When Odoacer overthrew the last emperor and did not declare himself the new Caesar, these landowners, our proto-feudal lords, gained complete independence. So, our proto-feudal lords, the castle owners, became completely independent. But here's what's important to realize. For the people of that time, Rome had not died. Yes, everyone saw that the western part of the empire was in chaos, and the western emperor was gone. However, such crises, changes of emperors, and civil wars had happened before. It wasn't an absolute catastrophe. After all, Constantinople stood firm. A true Roman emperor ruled there, and his authority was undisputed. And this would continue for another millennium. When Odoacer overthrew Romulus Augustulus in 476, he did not crown himself, but sent the imperial regalia to Byzantium. This was a symbolic gesture. Rome still exists. The center had simply shifted. Even the so-called barbarian kingdoms were in no hurry to abandon Roman civilization. They continued to mint Roman coins, speak and write in Latin, build Christian churches, aqueducts, and roads in the Roman style, revere the Pope, whose legitimacy stemmed from the supposed donation of Constantine. In the 9th century, the idea of Roman greatness was so potent that the enterprising German Charles, Charlemagne, successfully attempted to restore the empire. Contemporaries simply called his state the Empire, meaning the Eternal One. Rome's legacy was incredibly persistent, but this was the main pitfall. The early Middle Ages are often compared to scavengers feasting on a carcass being the empire. Roman achievements were often copied mechanically, without deep understanding of what they were and why they were needed. This process of copying led to the emergence of classical feudalism precisely in the former Roman territories, France, Italy, Spain, and Western Germany. In Byzantium, where the central authority was strong and the emperor maintained control, such a system simply could not develop. Thus, feudalism is a system that arose organically as a replacement for Rome's obsolete slave-owning structure, and it did so only in Western Europe. Why didn't it appear in India or Asia? 2 reasons. No roots. The absence of direct Western Roman influence meant there was nothing to copy. No vacuum. In Western Rome, the emperor's authority and legitimacy completely vanished. In a state of chaos, where every baron was a king unto himself, no new, universally recognized leader emerged. In other lands, Byzantium, China, the central authority, though it might weaken, was maintained. Yes, elements of fragmentation and large estates like latifundia existed everywhere, in Byzantium, China, and Japan. But due to strong centralization there, feudalism in its classical Western European form never took hold. What was the main achievement of this system? Slaves became peasants. They became free cultivators who, although they worked on someone else's land, labored primarily for themselves, giving up only a portion of the harvest and performing minor obligations in exchange for protection and the right to use the land. These landlords, landowners themselves, were a complex mix, descendants of the Roman elite, owners of latifundia, Germanic nobility, like chiefs and their military commanders, and even commoners who distinguished themselves, gained favor and were granted land and a title. This is how knighthood originated. Minor lords understood their vulnerability in this chaos and swore allegiance to larger ones. This is how the feudal hierarchy was built, from peasant to king. Kings, in turn, recognized the spiritual authority of the Pope. A common mistake is to assume that kings and lords possessed absolute power, while peasants were completely destitute and powerless. Peasants' rights were indeed minimal. But here's what's important. The nobility had virtually no rights either. In ancient Athens and Rome, courts and laws were enforced. But feudalism was the age of villages and castles. In reality, the law of the strongest prevailed. If the feudal lords doubted the king's authority, they ignored him. If the peasants knew the lord was weak, they would raise their pitchforks against him. If you watched Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon, you'll remember how the king literally had to beg his vassals for support. That is feudalism. Authority belonged to the one who could persuade others of it. Laws certainly existed, but without functioning courts, executive bodies, or police, their power was determined only by the size and force of your military might. If feudalism grew out of Roman ruins in the West, how did it end up in the lands of the Balts and Slavs, where Rome never established its roots? Here, the principle of catch-up copying was at work. In Eastern Germany and Austria, originally Slavic territories, the Germans conducted an aggressive expansion against pagan tribes. Some tribes, Lutici, Reni, were annihilated or assimilated. But others, the Czechs, Poles, Lithuanians, and Kashubians, were more flexible. They quickly adopted Catholicism and took the German system of governance as their model, which was already fully feudal. Bohemia became part of the Holy Roman Empire. Poland took a unique path. By the late Middle Ages, power was centralized around the monarch in most European countries. But the Polish nobility, szlachta, gained such immense power that they refused to share it with the king. The result? Rzeczpospolita, which literally translates to the Republic. In the lands of Rus, Kievan Rus, a completely unique scenario unfolded. In the era of the early Rurikids, power was centralized in Kiev, copying from three sources: Byzantium, the Varangians, and to a lesser extent, the West. However, after Prince Yaroslav the Wise, a period of decentralization occurred due to the division of power among his heirs. This was not Western feudalism in its pure form. The main difference from the West: all Rus's principalities, despite the feuds, traced their lineage back to the Rurikids. All of them recognized a single, albeit formal, center and considered themselves legitimate contenders for the throne. In the West, there was no single royal lineage or undisputed center. Legitimate dynasties were numerous, and most had dubious or manufactured histories. Any minor county had the chance to become great. Talents or luck were enough. It was this fierce, unceasing competition between hundreds of minor fiefdoms that became the key factor explaining the subsequent success of Western Europe. This was a kind of natural selection that gave rise to the next economic system, capitalism. The seeds of capitalism, buried in the ruins of Rome, were resurrected when Europe began to recover. And the point of resurgence was the cities, the very ones that people had abandoned en masse during the crisis. It was the cities that became the launching pad for European capitalism, and to some extent, for democracy. When dozens of independent forces, kings, lords, bishops clash, they are forced to start negotiating. Thus, a system of checks and balances gradually formed. Cities became the ideal place for the collision and balancing of these interests. Many of them were self-governing because they were not merely the fortifications of one small feudal lord. Their population consisted of merchants and artisans, whose services and goods were in such high demand that they could dictate terms to everyone, from petty feudal lords to the Pope himself. This is how powerful clans like the Medici or Grimaldi arose, along with capitalism and urban democracy. It was in the cities that law began to be fully reborn, in the form we know it and in the form the Romans knew it. For laws to function, institutions were needed: courts, police, banks, and an educated society willing to value and comply with these laws. Kings, naturally, disliked this and tried to forcibly impose the traditional rural serfdom order on the cities. But by then, many cities were so wealthy that they could afford their own mercenary armies and implement sanctioned policies against uncooperative feudal lords. In a crisis, the urban population was ready to take up arms to defend their highly valued way of life. The most urbanized regions were Central Europe, with the Hanseatic League, and Northern Italy, with those republics, while the Hanseatic League fell by the late Middle Ages due to the centralization of power in Scandinavia, France, Russia, and Austria. The Italian Republic survived until Napoleon. It's worth noting that some villages also tried to organize their own communes like the cities. However, without defensive walls, it was extremely difficult to defy the feudal lords. The only successful examples were Switzerland and Frisia, saved by their geographical inaccessibility. And the final condition, without which the Middle Ages cannot be understood, is the complete absence of nations. The concept of the nation would only form by the 19th century, leading to two major conflicts in the 20th. We emphasize, a nation is not just a group of people speaking the same language or sharing a similar appearance. In reality, it is an extremely complex, artificial construct woven from language, appearance, religion, territory, citizenship, shared history, and everything else one can tie into it. Debates rage even over whose invention a particular dish, dance, or item of clothing was. Why is that? Because the nation is an elusive concept that lacks clear universal criteria. It can be interpreted and manipulated in any direction, as long as the political imagination holds up. In the Middle Ages, people certainly needed self-identification, but the Church perfectly fulfilled this function. A Bavarian merchant and an Occitan resident might speak an incomprehensible language and drink beer instead of wine. But everything was fine because they were all Catholic. National states began to form closer to the late Middle Ages, and not based on culture but exclusively on political borders. For example, Occitans and Catalans were close relatives, but the Catalans, finding themselves under the Spanish kings, participated in the Reconquista. Occitania, under the French crown, fought against England. The people of Austria and Bavaria speak similar dialects, but ended up under the authority of different emperors. The population of Moscow felt more kinship with the people of Kiev, while Novgorod spoke a completely different dialect, was a republic, and belonged to the Hanseatic League. But Ivan III captured Novgorod, and Kiev ended up under the authority of Lithuania. Everything could have gone 1,000 other ways, but history doesn't deal in what-ifs. Beyond religious affiliation, it was much more important for the medieval person to know their social status. This, too, is essentially an invention of the Middle Ages. Rome had real social mobility, and Eastern kingdoms like Persia had simpler social structures. Here, society was rigidly divided into two camps, the nobility and the peasantry. The nobility identified with their lineage and their domain. The peasants identified primarily with their village. The peasants cared little about who they paid taxes to, Marquis of Carabas or some minor baron, if both equally demanded dues and forced them to fight in their quarrels. Without mass literacy, a unified education system, and especially without mass media, propaganda simply did not exist. Moreover, in the West, where central authority was weaker, peasants were never completely bound to the land and could freely move from one territory to another as needed. Genuine, rigid serfdom would only develop in the early modern period. The nobility itself was extremely mobile. One could manage one's estate remotely. Everyone wanted to live where the opportunities were greatest. The Borja family moved to Rome and became the Borgias. William of Normandy transitioned from a French duke to the King of England. The Rurikids allegedly moved from Sweden. What ultimately killed feudalism? Its end came with the emergence of centralized states which created courts, executive bodies, clear borders, and most importantly, the concept of the nation, to stop people from leaving their home region. Of course, none of this was a plan. These processes took Europe, as a reminder, almost 1,000 years. Capitalism, which flourished in the cities, proved its viability. Joint stock corporations, which grew out of medieval guilds, appeared in England and the Netherlands. The nobility, seeing the church's power decline and the rise of monarchies, began searching for a new parameter of identification, reflecting on their history under the influence of the Renaissance. It was here that nations began to coalesce based on political, religious, and linguistic differences. The nobility became the engine of nationalism, drawing borders and writing texts, not in Latin or Greek, but in national languages. In some places like France, England, Russia, and Spain, centralization was completed by the late Middle Ages. However, Germany and Italy remained semi-feudal patchwork states until the 19th century. All these processes were incredibly unique. Each country deserves a separate detailed video just about its own medieval history. And if you're interested in that, we will gladly start working on it right away. In the meantime, we hope that we have, at least in general terms, painted a clear picture for you. Until next time, friends, cheers!